Welcome back. You have probably heard this before. If you have enough faith, God will heal you. If you are still sick, your faith must be lacking. If your finances are still struggling, something must be blocking your faith. Pray more, give more, declare more, and if nothing changes, the blame falls on you. It sounds spiritual. But it places a heavy burden on people who are already hurting, and it does not reflect the full picture of what the Bible teaches. Let's start with Paul, one of the central figures of the New Testament, a man of deep faith who planted churches, performed miracles, and wrote much of the New Testament. And Paul was not always physically well. In Galatians chapter 4 verse 13, he mentions a physical illness that affected his ministry. In 2 Corinthians 12, he describes a thorn in the flesh, something persistent he asked God to remove. 3 times he prayed, and the answer was no, not because Paul lacked faith, but because God responded differently than he expected. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul was not healed in that moment, but he was sustained. Then there is Epaphroditus in Philippians chapter 2 verses 25 to 27, a faithful worker in the gospel, and Paul says he was seriously ill and nearly died. There is no suggestion of weak faith, just a clear acknowledgement that a committed believer was suffering physically. Then Timothy. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 23, Paul writes, "Use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses." Frequent illnesses. Paul does not tell him to increase his declarations. He gives practical advice. Because his condition was real and faith was not presented as a formula that removed it instantly. Now look at Hebrews 11, the chapter often called the Hall of Faith. It celebrates people who trusted God deeply. But notice how their stories end. Some experience deliverance. Others experience suffering. Some face jeers and flogging, chains and imprisonment. They were put to death. These were people commended for their faith, and many of them suffered greatly. Verse 39 says they were all commended, and yet did not receive everything promised in this life. So where does the idea come from that faith guarantees healing or financial success? Often it comes from taking real promises and applying them as universal formulas, from reading miracle accounts as patterns that must always repeat, and from assuming that God's blessing always shows up as physical comfort or material success. But in Scripture, faith is not a transaction. It is not something you use to produce a guaranteed outcome. James 5 does encourage prayer for the sick, and healing does happen. But the same passage also points to endurance and patience, because sometimes suffering remains, and faith is what carries you through it, not always what removes it immediately. One of the hardest effects of this teaching is what it can do to people who are already struggling. It can turn pain into self-blame. It can make someone feel that their suffering is evidence of failure, that if they were just doing more, believing more, getting it right, things would change. That is a heavy weight to carry. The Bible does not promise a life without hardship. It does point to something steady within it, God's presence, God's grace, God's sustaining strength. Psalm chapter 34 verse 19 says, "The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers them." Many troubles, not the absence of trouble, but the assurance that God is not absent within it. If you are sick, your condition is not proof that your faith is weak. If you are struggling, it is not evidence that God has stepped away from you. Scripture shows us faithful people in many different circumstances, including suffering, and it also shows God present with them. If this brought some clarity or relief, take a moment and sit with it. And if you want more conversations like this, you're welcome to stay.